She's mentally unfit to manage her own money, her daughter-in-law told the judge, without once looking at the 72-year-old woman seated 10 feet away. Margaret Whitmore did not flinch when she heard the words spoken aloud in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper and polished oak. She simply folded her gloved hands in her lap and kept her gaze steady on the American flag mounted behind the bench, as if the fabric itself could testify on her behalf. The Hamilton County Courthouse had always struck her as dignified, almost reassuring, with its marble floors and tall windows that let in clean Midwestern light. But that morning the air felt thinner, heavier, as though every whisper in the gallery carried judgment. Her son Ethan sat beside his wife Claire at the petitioner's table, his navy suit pressed sharp, his jaw set in a way Margaret recognized from his teenage years when he was determined to prove something to the world, and Claire, immaculate in cream silk, spoke with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed each sentence in front of a mirror. Margaret listened as Claire explained that recent memory lapses and confusion over finances made it necessary for the court to appoint a guardian to oversee Margaret's assets, including the 4-bedroom colonial home valued at just under $900,000 and the investment accounts her late husband had built over 40 years of disciplined saving. Ethan cleared his throat once, softly, and added that he was only trying to protect his mother from potential scams, from making decisions she might regret, from the stress of managing over $1.2 million in combined assets at her age. Margaret kept her back straight against the wooden chair and noticed the faint hum of the ceiling vent above her, the way dust motes drifted in a shaft of light across the courtroom. And she thought of how often she had sat in school auditoriums and church pews watching Ethan receive awards, trusting that love and loyalty were constants that did not expire with time. She did not interrupt, did not shake her head, did not defend herself when Claire mentioned that Margaret had misplaced important documents and had seemed disoriented during a recent conversation about property taxes, though Margaret clearly remembered that conversation and the exact figure discussed, $8,742 due in October, already scheduled for payment. 3 months earlier, Margaret had first sensed the shift when Claire suggested, over Sunday dinner, that perhaps it was time to simplify things and consider a senior living community with manicured lawns and scheduled activities, and Ethan had nodded too quickly, saying the house might be too much upkeep for someone her age, even though Margaret still walked 2 miles every morning around the neighborhood lake and managed her own grocery shopping without assistance. She had noticed small things after that: the safe code changed without explanation, bank statements redirected to Ethan's email for convenience, and a subtle but persistent tone in Claire's voice that carried both pity and calculation. Margaret had not argued then either. She had simply begun making phone calls of her own, quietly retrieving copies of documents from the bank branch on Main Street, requesting printed transaction histories, and reviewing them at her kitchen table late at night under the warm glow of a single lamp, tracing unfamiliar transfers with a steady finger while the grandfather clock in the hallway marked each passing hour. She discovered that funds had been moved from a joint account into a newly opened account bearing Claire's name as secondary holder, described as temporary management. And though the amounts were not catastrophic, they were deliberate, incremental, designed not to alarm at first glance. In the courtroom, as Claire concluded by stating that guardianship would ensure everyone's peace of mind, Margaret finally shifted her gaze from the flag to her son, meeting his eyes for a brief second. He looked away almost immediately, studying the legal pad in front of him as if it contained answers he preferred over his mother's silence. The judge adjusted his glasses and asked Margaret if she wished to respond, and for a moment the room seemed to pause, the scrape of a chair in the back row echoing louder than it should have. Margaret rose slowly, smoothing the front of her gray wool coat, aware of the weight of every stare in the gallery, and she spoke in a voice that was neither trembling nor raised, but measured, clear, and distinctly her own. She told the court that she appreciated her son's concern, that she had always valued family support, and that she understood the responsibilities tied to substantial assets. Then she added, almost gently, that she had managed household finances since 1978, through recessions, medical bills, and tuition payments, and that she continued to balance her accounts monthly, reconcile statements, and consult certified advisors when needed. She did not accuse, did not dramatize, did not reveal the documents tucked neatly in a leather folder beside her chair, because she understood that timing mattered more than emotion. As she sat back down, Margaret felt the same calm she had felt years ago when waiting for biopsy results that ultimately came back clear, a calm born not of denial, but of preparation. She had allowed Claire to believe the narrative of fragility, had permitted Ethan to assume she was too overwhelmed to notice the gradual tightening of control around her finances, and now, in this courtroom where her competence was being questioned, she knew that justice did not arrive in a rush of outrage, but in the quiet presentation of facts. The hearing would continue, statements would be weighed, and impressions would form, but Margaret Whitmore understood something her family did not. Silence was not weakness, and patience, when paired with evidence, could shift the balance of an entire room. When the judge announced a brief recess, the room exhaled in a low murmur of shifting chairs and hushed speculation, and Margaret remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, as if giving the air time to settle before she rose. Ethan leaned toward Claire, whispering something that made her nod with a tight, satisfied smile. And Margaret noticed the way Claire's fingers rested confidently on a leather portfolio that likely contained carefully organized statements about concern and responsibility, words polished to sound compassionate while carrying the quiet ambition of control. Margaret stepped into the courthouse hallway where fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over framed portraits of former judges, and she could still hear echoes of Claire's voice describing her as forgetful, overwhelmed, fragile, words that did not match the woman who had driven herself to the bank just 2 days earlier and reviewed 3 years of transaction histories line by line. She walked toward the drinking fountain at the end of the corridor, not because she was thirsty, but because she needed the few seconds of solitude, the cold splash of water against her fingertips grounding her in the present moment. 3 months earlier, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, she had been balancing her checkbook at the kitchen table when she noticed a transfer of $25,000. Labeled administrative adjustment, a phrase vague enough to slip past casual review, yet precise enough to be intentional. She had called the bank branch and asked to speak with the manager, a young man named Thomas who had known her by name for years, and he had explained that the transfer had been authorized through online access credentials linked to her primary account. Credentials she had not shared beyond Ethan's suggestion that it would be easier if he helped monitor things digitally. Margaret had thanked Thomas politely, hung up the phone, and written the date and time of the call on a yellow legal pad, the same pad where she kept grocery lists and reminders about annual maintenance on the furnace. She had not confronted Ethan that evening when he and Claire stopped by with a pie from the bakery on Maple Street, nor had she mentioned the transfer when Claire casually remarked that financial management could become confusing with age. Instead, Margaret had listened, nodded, and observed the way Ethan avoided direct answers about the details of online access. In the weeks that followed, smaller transfers appeared, 5,000 here, 3,000 there, always justified in the memo line as consolidation or temporary holding, and Margaret drove to the bank again, requesting printed copies of the digital authorization logs, which showed timestamps and originating devices. She learned that several transactions had been initiated from an internet address associated with Ethan and Claire's home office, a room she had visited once and admired for its tidy shelves and framed family photographs. Standing in the courthouse hallway now, Margaret remembered the afternoon she had quietly met with Daniel Brooks, the attorney who had handled her late husband's estate planning decades earlier, a man with silver hair and a steady voice who listened without interruption as she laid out the documents across his conference table. Daniel had examined the authorization logs, the account agreements, and the language of the guardianship petition Claire later filed, and he had leaned back in his chair, with an expression that suggested not surprise, but recognition. Margaret had told him she did not want a public spectacle, did not want her son humiliated, and Daniel had responded that clarity did not require cruelty, only evidence and patience. Together they had compiled a binder, organized by date and transaction, including copies of emails in which Claire referenced future plans for listing the house once legal authority was established, emails Claire believed were private, but had been forwarded to a shared family account years earlier when settings were first configured. The hallway clock ticked above the courtroom doors, and Margaret adjusted the strap of her handbag, feeling the familiar weight of the leather folder inside. She could hear Claire's heels approaching from behind, the rhythmic click against tile. And when Claire stopped a few feet away, she spoke in a tone softened for public spaces, suggesting again that this process was simply about protection and long-term stability. Margaret turned to face her, offering a small, almost serene smile, and replied that stability was indeed important, especially when managing over $1 million in assets accumulated through careful planning, and that transparency was the best form of protection for everyone involved. Claire's smile tightened just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her expression before she regained composure. Across the hall, Ethan stood near a window overlooking the parking lot, staring down at the rows of sedans and pickup trucks as though answers might be arranged between painted white lines. Margaret watched him for a moment, remembering the boy who once asked her to check his math homework twice because he wanted to be certain he had not made a mistake, and she wondered when certainty had become something he sought from someone else instead of from her. A bailiff opened the courtroom doors and called the parties back inside, and Margaret walked in without hesitation, the measured sound of her low heels steady against marble. She took her seat once more, hands folded, posture unshaken, and as the judge prepared to resume the hearing, Margaret felt no rush of anger, only a quiet resolve shaped by months of observation and documentation. She knew that narratives built on assumption could unravel under the weight of facts, and she was prepared to let the facts speak in their own time. Daniel Brooks rose slowly when the judge invited further clarification, and the simple movement shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom as though a window had been opened. He did not raise his voice or dramatize his tone. He merely adjusted his glasses and stated that while concern for a parent was admirable, legal guardianship required clear and convincing evidence of incapacity, not speculation, not inconvenience, and not disagreement over financial preferences. Margaret remained seated beside him, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly on the leather folder that had traveled with her from kitchen table to attorney office to courthouse bench, and she watched as Daniel placed a structured binder on the podium, each tab labeled by date in precise black lettering. Claire straightened in her chair, her expression still confident, though a faint crease appeared between her brows when Daniel referenced specific transaction dates that matched the transfers Margaret had quietly documented over the past quarter. He described the $25,000 administrative adjustment, the $5,000 consolidation, the $3,000 temporary holding, each entry paired with corresponding digital authorization logs indicating the originating internet address, and he asked the court to note that the device used to initiate those transactions was registered to Ethan and Claire's home office. Ethan shifted in his seat, the subtle scrape of his shoe against the floor echoing in the otherwise controlled silence, and Margaret did not turn to look at him because she did not need to see his reaction to understand that the narrative of forgetfulness was beginning to strain under the weight of detail. Daniel continued by presenting printed emails recovered from a shared family account, messages in which Claire discussed potential listing prices for the colonial home and estimated proceeds after sale, calculations written weeks before any formal guardianship petition had been filed. He emphasized that forward planning was not unlawful in itself, but that timing and transparency mattered when the property in question belonged solely to Margaret and had been maintained in her name since her husband's passing. The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the documents handed up by the clerk, and asked Claire whether she wished to respond to the characterization of the transfers. Claire cleared her throat and explained that she had only been helping to organize finances with Ethan's knowledge, that everything had been intended for Margaret's benefit, that sometimes older individuals did not understand the complexities of modern banking. Margaret felt the phrase older individuals settle in the air like a label applied too casually, and for the first time that morning she allowed herself to speak without waiting to be prompted. She addressed the judge directly, stating that she understood online banking procedures, that she had personally set up the initial account years ago, and that she had not authorized any permanent transfer of control, only temporary viewing access, which she had believed would foster trust rather than erode it. Her voice remained steady, not sharp, not defensive, and that steadiness carried more weight than raised emotion ever could. She explained that she had balanced household accounts since 1978, navigated tax filings, refinanced a mortgage during a recession, and ensured that tuition payments cleared on time for her son's education, and she concluded by saying that oversight was welcome when requested, but ownership should not be redefined without consent. Daniel then introduced a final document, a recent cognitive evaluation conducted by a licensed physician at Margaret's request, confirming that she was fully capable of managing her affairs, that her memory and reasoning were intact, and that there was no medical basis for involuntary guardianship. The courtroom grew quieter, the earlier murmur replaced by attentive stillness as the pieces aligned in a pattern more complex than simple concern. Ethan finally looked at his mother, and in his expression Margaret saw not anger but confusion, as though he were recalculating assumptions that had once seemed efficient and protective. Claire maintained her composure, yet her fingers tightened around her portfolio, the polished confidence from earlier now tempered by uncertainty. The judge asked a series of measured questions about consent, access permissions, and the timeline of the petition, and with each answer the difference between assistance and control became clearer. Margaret did not smile, did not show triumph. She simply sat upright, aware that dignity often spoke loudest when it refused to perform. As the hearing moved toward closing arguments, the balance in the room had shifted from presumption of fragility to recognition of autonomy, and Margaret understood that this was not merely about money or property values measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, but about authorship over one's own life, about the quiet authority earned through decades of responsibility. She had not come to court to defeat her son or embarrass her daughter-in-law. She had come to ensure that truth, documented carefully and presented calmly, could stand in plain view without distortion. When Daniel finished his final remarks, he stepped back beside her, and Margaret felt the steady rhythm of her own breathing, unhurried and certain, knowing that whatever decision followed would be based not on assumption, but on evidence patiently assembled and respectfully delivered. The courtroom remained still as the judge folded his hands and reviewed the final page of the cognitive evaluation, and in that stillness Margaret Whitmore felt the quiet shift from doubt to discernment settle across the room. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting pale rectangles across the polished floor, and the faint ticking of the wall clock measured seconds that seemed longer than they were. Ethan sat upright, but no longer leaned toward Claire, his shoulders squared in a posture that suggested uncertainty rather than resolve, while Claire kept her gaze forward, composed yet visibly calculating the direction of the judge's questions. The judge spoke deliberately, explaining that guardianship was not a tool for convenience or preemptive management, but a legal safeguard reserved for demonstrated incapacity, and he noted that the evidence presented did not establish such incapacity. He referenced the documented financial transfers, the digital authorization logs, and the physician's evaluation, and with each reference the framework of Claire's argument appeared less like protection and more like presumption. Margaret listened without outward reaction, though internally she felt the steady confirmation of what she had known since the first unexplained transfer appeared on her statement. Preparation would outlast accusation. The judge then addressed Ethan directly, asking whether he understood the distinction between offering assistance and assuming control, and Ethan hesitated before answering, his voice lower than earlier, acknowledging that he had believed he was acting in his mother's best interest, but that he had relied heavily on Claire's interpretation of events. The admission was not dramatic, yet it carried weight, a subtle unraveling of certainty that had once seemed immovable. Claire requested permission to clarify, reiterating that her intentions were grounded in long-term planning and family stability, and she emphasized that the property and investment accounts represented generational security. Margaret heard the phrase generational security and recognized how easily noble language could mask private ambition, yet she remained composed, aware that her restraint amplified the credibility of her documentation. After a measured pause, the judge announced that the petition for guardianship was denied, citing insufficient evidence of incapacity and raising concerns regarding unauthorized financial activity that warranted further review. The words were delivered without flourish, but they altered the direction of every relationship seated within that room. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly quieted by the bailiff, and Margaret felt Daniel place a reassuring hand near the binder on the table, not touching her, but close enough to signal shared understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, as though releasing tension he had not realized he carried, and for the first time since the hearing began, he turned fully toward his mother. There was no defiance in his expression now, only the dawning recognition that competence had never left her. Claire's posture remained upright, yet the polished certainty from earlier had faded, replaced by the practical awareness that documentation, not narrative, shaped outcomes in a courtroom. Margaret rose when instructed, smoothing her coat once more, and thanked the judge for his time in a voice that carried neither triumph nor bitterness. She did not glance toward Claire, nor did she offer reproach to Ethan, because the outcome itself spoke clearly enough. As the parties gathered their materials, the judge reminded them that transparency and consent formed the foundation of any financial arrangement within a family, and that trust, once strained, required deliberate rebuilding. Margaret absorbed the statement quietly, recognizing that while legal authority had been affirmed, emotional repair would require a different kind of patience. In the hallway outside the courtroom, footsteps echoed against marble as people dispersed, and Ethan approached his mother with a tentative expression, beginning to explain that he had feared she might become overwhelmed managing more than $1 million alone, that he had worried about market volatility and unexpected expenses. Margaret listened fully before responding, and when she spoke she did so with calm clarity, stating that concern was welcome when accompanied by conversation, not substitution, and that partnership could never be built on assumptions about decline. Claire stood a short distance away, her portfolio held firmly against her side, observing the exchange without interruption, and Margaret recognized that the path forward would depend not on argument, but on boundaries clearly defined. Outside, the afternoon air carried the crisp scent of early autumn, and the courthouse steps descended toward a parking lot lined with sedans and pickup trucks glinting in sunlight. Margaret paused at the top step, feeling the cool breeze against her face, aware that dignity was not restored by a ruling alone, but by the composure maintained throughout the challenge. She had entered the building as a woman described as unfit, and she exited as the documented author of her own affairs, her autonomy reaffirmed not through confrontation, but through evidence patiently assembled and respectfully presented. Margaret drove home alone that afternoon, the courthouse shrinking in her rearview mirror as the late autumn sun stretched long shadows across the highway, and she kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, not because she was shaken, but because she understood that steadiness was now her greatest statement. The radio remained off, the silence inside the car calm and deliberate, and as she turned into her quiet subdivision lined with maple trees shedding red and gold leaves, she felt neither victory nor bitterness, only clarity. The colonial house stood exactly as she had left it that morning, white shutters crisp against brick, the porch light still off, the brass numbers near the door catching light at just the right angle. This house had sheltered decades of birthdays, graduations, and Thanksgiving dinners measured in pounds of turkey and gallons of iced tea, and she paused for a moment in the driveway, aware that ownership meant more than legal title. It meant memory and responsibility intertwined. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of lemon polish from the night before, and Margaret placed her handbag on the entry table before walking directly to the kitchen, where the leather folder and remaining documents were set carefully beside the coffee maker. She did not rush to call anyone, did not text Daniel, did not replay the judge's words aloud, because she had prepared for this outcome long before the hearing began. Instead, she opened her laptop at the oak dining table and logged into her accounts with deliberate precision, reviewing balances, confirming that viewing permissions previously granted to Ethan had been formally revoked that morning through paperwork Daniel had filed immediately after the ruling. The numbers aligned exactly as she expected, each figure clear, each transaction documented, and she printed updated summaries, sliding them into a fresh binder labeled Personal Records 2026. An hour later, her phone vibrated gently on the table, and Ethan's name appeared on the screen. Margaret let it ring twice before answering, her voice composed, and Ethan spoke with a tone that blended apology and uncertainty, explaining that he had not intended to undermine her, that he had believed centralizing control would simplify matters, that Claire had emphasized efficiency and long-term growth. Margaret listened fully before responding that efficiency, without consent, often resembled replacement, and that growth built on assumption rarely endured. Ethan grew quiet on the other end, and she could almost see him standing in his own kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, realizing that the framework he trusted had shifted beneath him. She told him that love did not require guardianship, and that support must be invited, not imposed. And she ended the call not with accusation, but with an invitation to meet in person later that week under clearer understanding. After the call, Margaret moved through the house with measured intent, opening the hall closet where a small fireproof safe rested on the top shelf, entering a code only she now knew, and placing inside the original property deed, updated account statements, and a newly drafted document Daniel had prepared at her request earlier that month. The document outlined revised estate instructions, specifying charitable allocations and conditional distributions tied to transparency and mutual respect, not automatic inheritance. She closed the safe gently and stepped back, recognizing that protection did not require secrecy, only foresight. As evening approached, golden light filtered through the living room windows, illuminating framed photographs along the mantel, including one of Ethan at age 10 holding a science fair ribbon and another of Margaret and her late husband standing beside this very house on the day they paid off the mortgage. She traced the edge of the frame lightly, remembering that stability had always been earned through patience rather than haste. Later that night, she sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and outlined the next steps with the same careful handwriting she had used for decades, scheduling a meeting with her financial advisor, planning to establish a revocable trust fully controlled by her, and noting a charitable foundation in her husband's name that would fund scholarships at the local high school. Each line written felt less like defense and more like authorship. When darkness settled outside and the house grew quiet, Margaret brewed a cup of chamomile tea and carried it to the front window, watching as porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood. She did not feel isolated, nor did she feel triumphant. She felt anchored, aware that dignity had been tested and confirmed in equal measure. The hearing had affirmed her legal authority, but this evening affirmed something deeper, that autonomy maintained calmly, documented carefully, and exercised deliberately could reshape not only financial arrangements but the balance of respect within a family. She set the empty teacup in the sink, turned off the kitchen light, and walked upstairs with unhurried steps, knowing that tomorrow would not begin with defense but with decision, and that every choice from this point forward would be made not in reaction to doubt, but in alignment with the quiet strength she had carried all along. 2 days after the hearing, Margaret invited Ethan and Claire to the house for dinner, not as a gesture of surrender, but as a setting for clarity, and she prepared the meal herself with the same deliberate care she had used for decades, roasting a 4-pound chicken with rosemary and lemon, setting the oak table with white plates and cloth napkins pressed flat beneath her palms. The dining room looked unchanged from the countless family gatherings it had hosted, yet the air carried a new awareness, as though the walls themselves were listening. Ethan arrived first, holding a bottle of sparkling water instead of wine, his posture restrained, and Claire followed moments later, composed in a soft gray sweater, her expression carefully neutral. Margaret greeted them both with measured warmth, neither distant nor overly inviting, and gestured toward the table where 3 place settings waited evenly spaced beneath the chandelier. During the first minutes of conversation, they spoke about ordinary things, traffic on the interstate, a neighbor renovating his garage, the early frost predicted for the weekend, and Margaret allowed the familiarity to settle before shifting gently toward what mattered. She carved the chicken into even portions, placed food on each plate, and then folded her hands lightly in front of her as she began to speak. She explained that she had met with her financial advisor that morning and finalized the transfer of her primary accounts into a revocable trust under her sole authority, a structure designed not to exclude but to protect, and that any future assistance would require written consent and transparent documentation. She stated the information calmly, without accusation, as though outlining a household budget rather than redefining access to more than $1 million in assets. Ethan listened with lowered eyes, absorbing the measured finality in her tone, while Claire maintained her composure. Though her fingers tightened briefly around her fork, Margaret continued, saying that she had also revised her estate plan, allocating a portion of her estate to establish the Whitmore Scholarship Fund at the local high school. ensuring that graduating seniors pursuing accounting or finance would receive annual support measured in $5,000 increments, a detail she delivered not to provoke, but to demonstrate intention. Claire asked whether that meant the inheritance would be reduced, and Margaret replied that inheritance was never a guarantee, but a gift shaped by trust and respect, and that gifts could evolve when circumstances required. She emphasized that transparency would determine future decisions, not expectation. The conversation did not escalate, because Margaret refused to let it, and in her restraint lay the quiet authority that had eluded her family only weeks before. She explained that she would remain in the house for now, that she had scheduled independent property evaluations to understand market conditions, and that any discussion of selling would originate with her, not from projections drafted in someone else's office. Ethan finally spoke, acknowledging that he had allowed efficiency to override conversation, that he had mistaken concern for entitlement, and Margaret met his words without visible emotion, accepting the acknowledgement but not diminishing the lesson. She reminded him that partnership requires dialogue before decision, and that love does not authorize assumption. Claire listened more than she spoke, her earlier certainty replaced by attentiveness, and Margaret noticed the subtle shift in posture, the recognition that influence had limits when confronted with preparation. After dinner, they moved to the living room where framed photographs lined the mantel, and Margaret pointed to one from Ethan's college graduation, recalling how she had balanced extra shifts at work to ensure tuition payments cleared on time. She did not recount this as sacrifice, but as evidence of sustained capability, a reminder that responsibility had long been part of her identity. When the evening concluded, Ethan offered to clear the dishes, and Margaret allowed him to, observing quietly as he carried plates to the sink. The gesture small but meaningful. Claire thanked her for dinner with a tone more measured than before, and Margaret walked them to the door, the cool night air brushing against her as they stepped onto the porch. As their car pulled away, she did not feel isolation, only recalibration. Boundaries had been drawn not in anger but in ink, not through confrontation but through structure. She returned inside, turned off the porch light, and stood for a moment in the quiet foyer, aware that the balance within her family had shifted. From presumption to accountability, autonomy, once questioned in a courtroom, now lived comfortably within the walls of her own home, reinforced by decisions made deliberately and communicated without apology. She climbed the staircase slowly, hand gliding along the polished banister, knowing that respect restored through evidence required continued steadiness, and that the future would unfold not according to pressure, but according to the standards she had calmly set. In the weeks that followed the dinner, Margaret noticed that silence inside the house felt different than before, no longer heavy with suspicion, but measured with intention, and she moved through her mornings with a renewed rhythm, waking at 6:30, brewing fresh coffee, and reviewing market updates on her tablet before walking 2 miles around the neighborhood lake, where frost now edged the grass in thin silver lines. The air carried the clean sharpness of late autumn, and each breath reminded her that clarity was not a single decision but a daily practice. She had met twice more with her financial advisor, finalizing the scholarship framework and confirming that the trust documents were filed properly with both the bank and her attorney, and she kept printed confirmations in a labeled binder stored securely in the hall closet safe. Ethan began calling more frequently, not to ask about accounts but to check in about her day, and Margaret noticed the change in tone, a carefulness that suggested he was recalibrating how he approached conversations. One afternoon he asked whether he could stop by to review the scholarship structure, expressing interest rather than entitlement, and Margaret agreed, setting a time for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock sharp. When he arrived, he carried a notebook instead of assumptions, and they sat at the oak dining table, where she explained how $5,000 per student would be awarded annually, funded by a conservative investment allocation designed to preserve principal while generating modest growth. She described expense ratios, diversification, and long-term yield expectations with steady clarity, and Ethan listened with a focus that reminded her of the boy who once asked for help understanding fractions. Claire did not attend that meeting, citing prior commitments, and Margaret noted the absence without judgment, understanding that influence sometimes recedes before it redefines itself. Later that evening, Claire sent a brief message expressing appreciation for the dinner, and acknowledging that the recent months had created misunderstandings, and, though the message was concise, it lacked the polished persuasion of earlier emails, carrying instead a tone of recognition. Margaret did not respond immediately. She allowed time to perform its quiet work, knowing that accountability matures when not rushed. Meanwhile, Daniel informed her that the court had initiated a routine review of the unauthorized transfers, a procedural matter rather than a dramatic escalation, and Margaret requested that the focus remain administrative rather than punitive, stating that correction mattered more than spectacle. Funds previously moved were returned to their original accounts, and digital permissions were formally documented under revised agreements. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, Margaret drove to the local high school to meet with the principal about the scholarship. Walking through hallways lined with lockers and bulletin boards announcing upcoming science fairs and basketball games, and she felt a sense of forward momentum that extended beyond family tension. The principal expressed gratitude, outlining how the scholarship could support students pursuing business or finance degrees, and Margaret listened with attentive interest, asking about application criteria and oversight committees, ensuring that transparency would define this new chapter as clearly as it had defined her defense in court. At home that evening, she stood in the living room studying the photograph of her late husband beside the paid-off mortgage document framed years ago, and she spoke softly, not out of sorrow but acknowledgement, affirming that the values they had built together remained intact. Ethan visited again the following weekend, this time accompanied by Claire, and the atmosphere was noticeably steadier. Claire apologized directly, stating that ambition for security had clouded judgment, and Margaret received the words without dramatization, explaining that security must never bypass consent. The conversation unfolded calmly, without raised voices, and Margaret outlined clear boundaries moving forward. No shared access without written authorization, no financial planning conducted in her name without her presence, and no property discussions initiated without her invitation. Both Ethan and Claire agreed, their nods measured rather than defensive. As they left that evening, Margaret closed the door gently and stood for a moment in the quiet foyer, aware that authority reaffirmed required maintenance through consistency, not confrontation. The house no longer felt contested, it felt anchored. She returned to her desk, updated her personal ledger with the latest account confirmations, and scheduled her annual review meeting for January, marking the date in ink. Outside, wind rustled the remaining leaves from the maple trees, and Margaret recognized that seasons changed whether acknowledged or not, but preparation determined whether change unsettled or strengthened. She turned off the lights downstairs, ascended the staircase with unhurried steps, and understood that dignity restored through calm resolve could redefine not only legal standing, but the architecture of respect within a family. Winter settled gradually over the neighborhood, and by early December a thin layer of snow traced the edges of rooftops and mailboxes, softening the sharp lines of the street where Margaret had lived for more than 30 years. Inside the house, holiday lights framed the front window in steady white strands, not extravagant, not minimal, simply balanced, much like the woman who had hung them herself without waiting for assistance. The scholarship announcement had been published in the local newspaper the week before, a modest column describing the Whitmore Scholarship Fund and its focus on integrity and financial stewardship, and Margaret kept a clipped copy folded neatly on her desk, not for praise, but as a quiet marker of forward motion. Ethan visited one evening after work, removing his coat carefully and setting it over the back of a dining chair, and he asked if she would consider attending the high school awards ceremony in the spring together. Margaret studied his face for a moment before nodding, recognizing that rebuilding trust often began with shared presence rather than grand apologies. Claire arrived shortly after, carrying a small tin of homemade cookies, and the gesture felt less strategic than before, more grounded, as she thanked Margaret again for the clarity she had insisted upon. Admitting that ambition had once blurred her perspective, Margaret accepted the tin with a simple smile, understanding that acknowledgement did not erase the past but could reshape the future. Later that evening, as they sat in the living room with soft instrumental music playing from a speaker on the bookshelf, Ethan spoke about reviewing his own financial planning, mentioning that he had opened separate accounts to ensure transparency in his household, and Margaret listened with attentive calm, noting the subtle, but meaningful shift from assumption to responsibility. She explained that independence did not mean isolation, that collaboration could thrive when rooted in respect, and that her decisions moving forward would continue to reflect both prudence and purpose. No one interrupted, no one raised a voice, and in that steady exchange the architecture of their family felt sturdier than it had in months. When Ethan and Claire prepared to leave, snowflakes had begun drifting down beneath the porch light, small and deliberate, and Margaret stepped outside with them, her wool coat buttoned securely against the cold. She watched as they walked toward their car, not with suspicion, but with measured hope, aware that trust, once tested, required consistency more than sentiment. After they drove away, she returned inside, extinguished the candles on the mantel, and paused beside the framed photograph of her husband, reflecting not on conflict, but on continuity. The house no longer echoed with doubt, and the quiet that followed felt earned rather than imposed. Margaret turned off the last light downstairs and climbed the staircase slowly, her steps unhurried, knowing that the balance she had reclaimed was not temporary but anchored in preparation, documentation, and calm resolve. And as snow continued to fall outside, she understood that dignity, once affirmed through patience and clarity, could illuminate even the longest winter evening. By early spring the snow had melted into narrow streams along the curb, and the maple trees outside Margaret Whitmore's home carried the first pale hints of green, subtle but undeniable, much like the shift that had taken place within her family over the past several months. She stood at the front window one mild Saturday morning, sunlight warming the hardwood floor beneath her feet, reflecting on how quickly assumptions could grow when left unchallenged and how deliberately they must be corrected. The Whitmore Scholarship Fund had received its first round of applications, 12 envelopes neatly stacked on her dining table, each containing transcripts, recommendation letters, and essays written by seniors who understood that money, like trust, required stewardship. Margaret reviewed them carefully, a cup of black coffee at her side, reading each line with the same precision she once applied to monthly bank statements. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived to help her sort the applications, not because he had access to the funds, but because she had invited him to observe the process, and he sat across from her with a legal pad, jotting down notes about grade point averages and community involvement. There was no tension in the room, only focused collaboration shaped by clear boundaries. Claire joined them shortly after, bringing a folder of printed guidelines she had researched about nonprofit oversight. And her tone carried thoughtful restraint rather than persuasion. Margaret acknowledged the effort with a nod, appreciating contribution without surrendering authority. Together they narrowed the applicants to 3 finalists, discussing merit and need in measured terms, and Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction in watching her son engage not as a controller of assets, but as a participant in purpose. Weeks later, on a bright May evening, they attended the high school awards ceremony, seated in folding chairs beneath a banner that read Class of 2026, and when Margaret's name was announced as the benefactor of the new scholarship, she rose calmly and walked to the podium without flourish. She spoke briefly about responsibility, about the discipline required to manage both dollars and relationships, and about the importance of consent in every partnership, her words simple yet resonant. Ethan watched from the audience with visible pride, and Claire applauded alongside him, and Margaret understood that the greatest correction had not occurred in a courtroom, but in the steady rebuilding of respect over time. That summer, Margaret made a decision that surprised no one yet unsettled expectations in the best possible way. She listed the colonial house for sale, not out of pressure but by choice, selecting a reputable agent and setting a price aligned with current market analysis. And when an offer arrived slightly above asking, she accepted after thoughtful review. The closing took place on a clear August morning, and as she handed over the keys, she felt neither loss nor regret, only gratitude for decades of memories held within those walls. The proceeds were transferred directly into her trust, and within weeks, she purchased a smaller 2-bedroom cottage near a lake in northern Vermont, a place measured not by square footage but by serenity. Ethan and Claire helped her move, carrying boxes labeled kitchen and personal records up the narrow porch steps, and Margaret observed the care in their movements, the absence of assumption in their questions. She organized her new office by the window overlooking water that shimmered in late afternoon light, placing her ledgers in a drawer and her husband's photograph on the desk beside them. In the months that followed, family dinners resumed in a different rhythm, sometimes hosted at her cottage, sometimes at Ethan and Claire's home, always with conversation grounded in mutual regard. Financial discussions, when they occurred, were transparent and invited, and Margaret noticed that Ethan now asked before offering suggestions, a subtle but meaningful recalibration. One evening, as autumn returned and leaves began to turn amber along the shoreline, Margaret sat alone on her porch wrapped in a light sweater, reviewing quarterly statements that reflected steady growth and charitable distributions already made to the first scholarship recipient. She closed the binder gently and looked out across the lake, understanding that justice, in the end, had not been a dramatic reversal but a quiet alignment of truth with structure. The wind carried a faint ripple across the water, and Margaret felt anchored in a way that transcended property values or account balances. She had preserved her autonomy without bitterness, redefined her boundaries without hostility, and transformed a challenge into a legacy measured not only in dollars but in dignity. As evening settled and the sky shifted from gold to deep blue, she rose from her chair and stepped inside, turning on a single lamp near the window, the warm glow reflecting outward into the dusk, a steady light that required no announcement to be seen.